Do you even know what year it is, Mrs. Calloway? That is what my own son's lawyer asked me, and he smiled when he said it. And Daniel just sat there in his expensive suit, doctor. Calloway, the surgeon this whole town trusted with their lives, having sworn to a judge, under oath, that his own mother had lost her mind. I looked straight at him until he had to look away. 43 years I had known that face, since the day it first opened its eyes in my arms. My name is Ruth Calloway. I am 66 years old, and I am going to tell you exactly what a dead man's money did to my boy. I have kept this story locked up inside me for a long time, and I think it is finally time somebody heard it, all of it, the way it really happened, and not the way the papers told it. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please, stay with me until the end. Because to understand how a mother ends up in a courtroom fighting her own child, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, back before the money, back to a little house on the edge of town, and the man who built it with nothing but his two hands and a paycheck that never quite stretched far enough. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where the women learned young that family was the one thing you never walked away from, no matter what. My mother taught me how to cook a Sunday dinner and how to sew a hem and how to sit up all night next to a feverish child without ever once complaining about it. But mostly she taught me to love people without keeping a running tally. And Lord help me, I did. I loved like that my whole life. No conditions, no fine print. Some days I think that was the best thing about me. Other days I think it was the exact thing that almost put me in the ground. I married Walter Calloway when I was barely 20 years old. He was not a rich man, and he never once pretended to be. He was a lineman for the county power company, which is a fancy way of saying he spent 40 years climbing wooden poles in the freezing rain and the summer heat so everybody else in town could flip a switch and never think twice about it. When a storm knocked the power out at 2 in the morning, Walter was the one out there in the dark with his boots on, up on a pole while the wind tried its best to peel him off it. He came home smelling like ozone and burnt coffee, and he never acted like he had done a single special thing. He just said somebody had to keep the lights on. That was Walter all over. He would give you the shirt off his back and then apologize it was not a nicer shirt. We did not have much, but we made it work. Walter built our house himself, board by board, on a scrap of land nobody else wanted, and it took him 3 years of weekends and every dime we could scrape together. When it was done, it was not fancy, but it was ours, and it was solid. He said a house ought to be built the way a man ought to live, honest all the way through, no rot hiding behind the paint. And out on the front porch, he hung a wooden swing that he made with his own hands, sanded so smooth you could run your palm across it your whole life and never catch a splinter. Every single evening of our marriage, after supper, the two of us sat on that swing and watched the light drain out of the sky, and he would take my hand like we were still courting. You remember that swing. It is going to matter more than you think. Walter had a saying about money. He said money was like a river. When it is just a trickle, everybody shares what there is and gets along fine. But when it comes down all at once in a flood, some folks learn to swim and some folks just plain drown. I did not understand what he meant back then. I understand it now. God, do I understand it now. We had 3 children, and I loved all 3 the same. But I will be honest with you. They came out of me like 3 completely different weather systems. Grace, my middle one, was all sunshine, the kind of kid who dragged home stray cats and cried at television commercials. Sam, my baby, was steady and easy, a big soft-hearted boy who grew up to be a firefighter, which surprised exactly nobody. And then there was my oldest, Daniel. Daniel was born when I was 23, and from the very start he was different. A serious little boy, quiet, watchful, the kind who kept his feelings locked up tight like they were something dangerous to let out. He hardly ever asked to be held, but he was sharp as a tack. Teachers noticed it early. And more than anything, that boy was ambitious. He wanted out. He wanted to be somebody, somebody important, somebody nobody in the world could look down on. And I think Looking back now, a whole lot of that came from being poor, because we were poor, and Daniel felt every inch of it. He wore his cousin's hand-me-downs to school, and he heard the other kids snicker about it. His sneakers had holes worn clean through, and he stuffed cardboard inside to keep socks dry, and he never breathed a word of it to me. I found that out years later, and it about broke my heart. I did not know how much that shame was eating him alive. I thought kids were tougher than that. I thought love in the house was enough to paper over the empty spots in the wallet. That is one of about 100 things I got dead wrong. When Daniel said he wanted to be a doctor, Walter and I did not so much as blink. We just sat down and figured out how to make it happen. Walter picked up every extra shift they would throw at him, and I took on private nursing work on the side, sitting up overnight with old folks, doing wound care and med passes on my days off. We ate an awful lot of beans that decade. We skipped vacations, and it was worth every bit of it the day that boy walked across the stage with a medical degree in his hand. Walter cried. My Walter, who I could count on one hand the times I ever saw him cry, stood there in his one good suit clapping with those big rough hands, tears just rolling down his face. It was the proudest day of our whole lives. Daniel became a surgeon, a good one, a respected one, the kind of name people said with a little hush in their voice. He married a woman named Marissa, who came from real money, the sort of family that has a place at the lake and knows which fork is which. Marissa was polite to me the way you are polite to the help. She never once looked at me with anything you could honestly call warmth. To her, I was the poor mother-in-law from the sticks, the woman who did not belong at her nice parties. And I knew it, and I kept my mouth shut. Because you learn to swallow a lot when you love somebody. But I noticed. Mothers always notice. Now I have to tell you about Harold, because none of the rest of it makes a lick of sense without Harold. Harold Prescott owned the electrical contracting outfit Walter worked for most of his life. He started that company out of the back of a beat-up pickup and built it into something real, and he never forgot the men who climbed the poles for him. Harold and his wife Eleanor never had children of their own, and I have always figured that is why they more or less adopted our whole family. Sunday dinners, birthday cards with a 20 tucked inside, that kind of thing. Then about 11 years ago, Eleanor got sick, cancer the fast and mean kind, and because I was a hospice nurse by then, I was the one who took care of her at the end, in her own home, the way she wanted. I sat with that woman through her final months. I held her hand when she was scared, and I kept her comfortable when the medicine was about all there was left to give. And when she slipped away, it was quiet, and I was right there beside her. Harold never forgot that. Not for one single day for the rest of his life. After Eleanor was gone, I kept checking in on Harold, because that is just what you do. You do not let a grieving old man rattle around an empty house all by himself. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being a nurse looking in on a patient, and it just turned into a friendship, a real one. For about 10 years, that man was one of the dearest friends I had in this world. He and Walter would park themselves on my porch swing and argue about the Reds and the Guardians until it got dark. He came to our table for Thanksgiving. He was family, not by blood, but in every single way that actually counts. Walter died 4 years ago. A heart attack, right out of a clear blue sky. He ate breakfast with me one morning, kissed the top of my head the way he always did, told me not to work too hard, and by that afternoon he was gone. No goodbye. Nothing. The pain of it nearly took me all the way under, and there were mornings I honestly did not want to come back up. But I did, because that is what women like me do. We survive. And Harold, bless that man, checked on me every week after Walter passed, the very same way I had checked on him. Grief knows grief. So that was my life. A widow in a house full of photographs, tending a garden that was really Walter's, 3 grown kids, and a small circle of people I loved. My oldest son had drifted a good long ways off by then. His visits got rare, always some excuse, work, a conference, a trip out of state. And once in a great while, I would get a good look at the life he was living, The enormous house behind the gate, the two cars that cost more than my whole home, Marissa in her designer everything, and a little voice in the back of my head would pipe up and say, "Ruth, how in the world do those two afford all of that?" I remember one Christmas he showed up late, checked his watch twice before he even took his coat off, took a call out in the driveway, and left before the pie. Everything about him was expensive and nothing about him was easy. But I pushed the worry away every time. He was a surgeon. Surgeons do fine. I told myself that 100 times over. I did not want to see what I did not want to see. And I am telling you that right there is the most dangerous kind of blindness there is. The kind you choose all on your own. And then a little over a year ago, Harold died too, 83 years old, in his sleep, peaceful as could be. I cried at his funeral like I had lost a second husband, because in a way I had. I figured that was the end of it. Another good man in the ground, another empty chair at the table. I had no idea. I did not have the first clue what that old man had quietly set in motion, or what it was about to do to my family. Because 2 weeks after we buried Harold, my son Daniel called me on the phone, and his voice sounded strange. Excited in a way I had not heard out of him in years. He said, "Mom, you are not going to believe this." And that phone call was the last easy breath I would take for a very, very long time. "Mom, you are not going to believe this." That is how it started. I was standing at my kitchen counter with a dish towel in my hand and the phone tucked up against my ear. And Daniel's voice was coming through so fast and so bright it hardly sounded like him at all. He said Harold Prescott had left it to us. Almost all of it. To our family. "Mom," he kept saying, like he needed to say it twice to make it stick. "We are talking millions." I had to sit down. I pulled out one of the kitchen chairs, the same second-hand chairs Walter and I bought 40 years back, and I just sat there with my mouth hanging open. Millions. I could not make the word mean a single thing. Harold had done all right for himself. Everybody in town knew that, but I never once sat on my porch running numbers on what the man was worth. He was just Harold to me. He was the fella who argued about the Reds and ate my Thanksgiving turkey and grieved his Eleanor right alongside me. Danja was already going a mile a minute. There was a lawyer. He's a formal reading. They wanted the whole family in the room. He was throwing around figures and talking about the estate and what it all meant. And underneath the excitement, there was this other thing in his voice I could not quite put my finger on. It sounded almost like relief, like a man who had been holding his breath a long, long time and finally got to let some of it out. I did not think a thing of it back then. Why would I? Lord knows I think about it plenty now. I called Sam that night because I had to tell somebody or I was going to bust. My baby boy just laughed, that big, easy laugh of his, and said, "Well, how about that?" The old man came through. He was not thinking about the money, not really. He said the only thing he cared about was that somebody was finally going to make sure his mama was taken care of. And then he made some crack about how he was going to have to start calling me a rich lady. And I told him to hush. Grace cried on the phone the next morning before she even said hello. That was my Grace all over. The two of them heard the exact news I did, and neither one of them thought about themselves for so much as a second. I want you to hold on to that, because it is going to matter later. The reading was that Friday, at the office of Harold's lawyer, a man named Raymond Ostrander who had done Harold's business for 30 years. It was not some big, fancy law firm downtown, just a plain office over on the square with a coffee pot in the corner, and a lot of old law books that looked like nobody had cracked them in a while. I dressed careful. I put on my good gray dress and Walter's mother's pearl earrings, because I wanted to look like somebody Harold would not have been ashamed to leave his name to. We all sat down around this long table. Grace on one side of me, Sam on the other, and across from us sat Daniel, in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly bills, and next to him sat Marissa, with her legs crossed just so, and her sunglasses pushed up on top of her head even though we were indoors. She gave me this little smile when I came in, the kind of smile that does not go anywhere near a person's eyes. Cool, careful. I had spent 20 years getting smiled at exactly like that, so I knew it when I saw it. Mr. Ostrander opened up a leather folder and cleared his throat and told us how sorry he was for our loss. And I could tell he meant it, because his voice caught a little when he said Harold's name. Then he explained that Harold had not left a regular will, exactly. He had set everything up in what he called a living trust, and there was a professional trustee, a whole trust company, that was going to handle the money right alongside the family. Harold had been very deliberate about the whole thing, Mr. Ostrander said. Very careful. He had left instructions. He said that last part slow, like it meant something, and at the time it just went right over my head. I did not understand yet how careful that old man had really been, or who he had been careful about. Then he started to read. The bulk of the estate, $7 million, was going to set up a scholarship fund for young people going into the trades. Electricians, welders, linemen, plumbers, the kind of work Harold built his whole life on, and the kind of work my Walter did until the day he died. Harold named it the Prescott Calloway Trade Scholarship, Prescott for his company, and Calloway for my husband. When Mr. Ostrander read Walter's name out loud in that quiet office, I had to press my lips together, hard to keep from coming apart, right there at the table. And the three kids, Daniel and Grace and Sam, were all named to sit on the board that ran it. Then he read that each of the three children would receive $1 million. Grace put her hand over her mouth. Sam let out this long breath like the wind had been knocked out of him. And I looked over at Daniel and I waited to see him smile. He did not smile. I watched my son's face while a stranger told him he had just inherited $1 million. And instead of joy, I watched something go cold and still behind his eyes, like a light getting switched off in a back room. I watched him do arithmetic. I did not know then what he was adding up, or why a man handed $1 million would look at the ceiling like a trapdoor had just opened underneath his chair. But I saw it, and Marissa saw it too, because her hand slid over onto his arm, and the two of them had this quick little look between them that I did not understand and did not like. Then Mr. Ostrander said there was one more provision, and he took off his glasses and looked right at me. Harold had left $1.5 million, free and clear, no conditions of any kind, to Ruth Calloway. In recognition, the letter said, of what she had been to Eleanor at the end, and to me for all the years after, for her kindness, which the world does not pay for and does not deserve. Mr. Ostrander read it just like that, and then he slid an envelope across the table to me with my name on the front in Harold's own shaky handwriting. The room went quiet. Grace was hugging me, and Sam had his hand on my shoulder, squeezing so hard it almost hurt. And both of them were saying, "You deserve it, Mom. God knows you deserve it." And I could not say a word. $1.5 million. Me, a 66-year-old widow who had never in her life had more than a few $1,000s sitting in the bank at one time. But my eyes went to Daniel. They just went there on their own. And what I saw on my oldest son's face froze the blood right in me. It was not happiness. It was not even disappointment. It was rage. Bald, pure rage, barely held down behind a jaw, clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He was looking at me, at his own mother, the way you would look at somebody who had reached across the table and taken something that belonged to you. And Marissa beside him had gone white as a sheet. That cool little smile finally wiped clean off her face. I did not understand it. I sat there holding an envelope from a dead man who loved me on what should have been one of the strangest and finest days of my life. And I could not for the life of me understand why my son was looking at me like I was the enemy. He came and found me out in the parking lot after, while Grace was warming up the car. He put his hand on my elbow, gentle enough, and steered me off to the side by the building where nobody could hear. Up close, he looked tired, worn thin in a way I had not noticed under the office lights. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about this money." I told him I was still trying to catch my breath, that maybe we could all sit down together and figure things out. He shook his head like I had missed the whole point. Mom, that is a lot of money, he said in no offense. But a woman in your situation does not have the first idea what to do with a sum like that. You have never handled money. You do not understand investments, or taxes, or what these people out there will try to pull on a widow sitting on $1.5 million in cash. You need someone looking out for you. And it should be family. It should be me. Let me manage it for you. I know the right people. I will make sure you are protected. Something in my stomach twisted up cold. I told him Sam knew about money, that Sam could help me, that I would find somebody honest if I needed help. And Daniel's voice got real quiet then, quiet and smooth. And he said, Mom, I want you to think about something. Harold Prescott was an old man, all alone in that big house. And you were over there every single week, weren't you? A lonely widow, a lonely widower. And now here comes $1.5 million out of nowhere, just for you. He let that hang there a second. Does that not strike you as strange? He said. Because it is going to strike other people as strange. People are going to talk. I am just trying to protect you from how this looks, Mom. That is all I am doing. It took me a good long moment to understand what my own child was saying to me. He was standing in a parking lot, suggesting that there had been something between Harold and me. Or worse, he was suggesting that a foolish old woman had let herself get taken in, that I was not right in the head enough to see it. I could not even tell which one he meant, and I think that was on purpose. I felt like the ground had tilted sideways under my feet. Daniel, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. That is an ugly thing to say. He just smiled at me, and it was not his smile anymore. It was Marissa's, that cool, careful thing that never reaches the eyes. Grace was pulling the car around by then. He gave my elbow one last little pat, like I was a child he was done arguing with. Think about it, Mom, he said. You will come around. You always do the smart thing eventually. And then he walked off toward that gleaming car and his wife, and I stood there in the cold with a dead man's envelope in my purse. And for the first time in my whole life, I was scared of my own son. I got in the car and Grace asked me what he wanted, and I told her nothing. Honey, just money talk. But that was a lie, because I already knew, way down deep in the part of a mother that always knows first, that something between Daniel and me had just cracked wide open. And I had no earthly idea how far down that crack was going to go. 2 weeks later, I found out. It came in the mail, in a thick envelope with a law firm's name printed up in the corner, and my hands were shaking before I even got it open. I stood in my own front hallway and read that letter 3 times before the words would hold still long enough to mean anything. It was a petition for guardianship. My son Daniel was asking a court of law to declare that I, Ruth Calloway, was no longer capable of taking care of myself or my own affairs. The paper said I was suffering from age-related cognitive decline. It said I had shown signs of confusion and poor judgment, and that I could no longer be trusted to manage my own money or make my own decisions. It said I needed a guardian appointed to handle everything for me, and it named the person volunteering for the job. Him, my oldest boy, the one whose diapers I changed, the one I sat up all night with when the fever came, the one I skipped my own life to put through medical school. I have never in my life felt anything quite like what I felt standing there. It was not like grief, which comes on you soft and slow and settles in. This was more like the floor, just dropping straight out from under me. I sat down hard on the bottom step of my own staircase, and the envelope slid out of my hands and hit the floor. And I cried the way I had not cried since the afternoon they told me Walter was gone. Not quiet tears. Big, ugly, heaving sobs that came up from somewhere I did not even know I had. How? How does the child who grew inside your own body, who nursed at your breast, who learned to walk hanging onto 2 of your fingers, how does that child stand up in front of a judge and tell the world his mother has lost her mind? The money. It was all about the money. I did not understand yet how or why, but I knew that much in my bones. This was never about me falling down or forgetting a bill. This was about $1.5 million sitting in a bank account with my name on it, and a son who had looked at that number, and started doing arithmetic. I do not know how long I sat on that step, long enough that the light in the hall went gray and dim, and then I did the only thing I could think to do. I called Sam. He must have heard something break in my voice, because he did not ask a single question. He just said, "Do not move. Mom, I am coming." And he hung up. 20 minutes later, his truck was in my driveway. And when I put those papers in his hands and he read them, I watched my sweet, easygoing boy turn to somebody I had never seen. His face went hard and red and his hands were shaking. And he said a few words I will not repeat here. And then he said he was going to drive over to Daniel's house right that minute and have it out with him. I grabbed his arm and I said, "No, no more fighting. Please." And Sam looked at me with tears standing in his eyes. And he said, "Mom, he is trying to rob you. He is trying to take your money and your freedom and your good name all at once. We cannot just sit here." And I did not have an answer for him because he was right. Sam called Grace that night, and my girl was on a plane home before the sun came up. By the next evening, both my younger kids were sitting in my living room, the same living room where I had rocked all three of them as babies, trying to figure out how to defend their mother from their own brother. Grace knew a woman, a lawyer from her work as a social worker, somebody who dealt with exactly this kind of thing. Elder law, she called it. She got on the phone, and by morning we had an appointment. Her name was Miriam Katz, and I liked her the second I met her, because she did not talk to me like I was old or fragile or slow. She talked to me like I was a grown woman with a problem to solve. She sat across from me at her desk and read through Daniel's petition, and I watched her mouth get tighter and tighter the further she went. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me and she said, "Mrs. Calloway, I want you to hear me clearly. This is thin. There is no real medical evidence here. What your son has done is take a handful of completely ordinary things and dress them up to look like proof of something they are not. And that is exactly what he had done. That is the part I want you to understand, because it is so much worse and so much colder than a simple lie. Daniel did not invent some big dramatic story. He did not have to. He just took my whole ordinary life and twisted it in the light until it looked sick. I had slipped on the ice on my back steps that winter and gone to the emergency room for my wrist. Everybody in Ohio falls on the ice. But in Daniel's petition, that fall became evidence of unsteadiness and possible impairment. I had missed a payment on my water bill 1 month, because after Walter died, I was still learning which bills he used to handle, and honestly because my heart was not in much of anything that whole first year. In the petition, that one late bill became a pattern of financial mismanagement and confusion. He wrote that I had seemed disoriented at a family gathering, which meant I had gotten quiet and sad at my own husband's memorial dinner. He took my grief and he called it dementia. He took my ordinary human aging and he called it decline. He took 40 years of a marriage where Walter paid the water bill, and he called it proof I could not run my own life. And here is the thing that made it dangerous. He was a doctor. When Ruth Calloway, retired nurse, says her mind is fine, that is one old woman's word. But when Dr. Daniel Calloway, the respected surgeon, the man half the county trusted to cut them open and sew them back up, when that man stands up and says gravely that he has concerns about his mother's cognition, well, people listen. People nod along. His white coat made his lies sound like a diagnosis. And I could see, right from the start, that a piece of the world was going to believe him just because of who he was and what I was. He was the successful son doing the hard, loving thing, and I was just the confused old widow who could not see it. Miriam explained to me how it was going to go. The court was not just going to take Daniel's word for it. Thank the Lord. She said there would be a first hearing before long, just to sort out the temporary matters while the case was pending, and then a full and final hearing further down the road, once all the evidence was gathered in. And she said that in a guardianship case like this, the court appoints its own independent evaluator, its own doctor, somebody with no dog in the fight, to actually examine me and report back to the judge. She said if my mind was sound, and she could plainly see that it was, then an honest, independent evaluation was the best weapon we had. But she also warned me. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, I am not going to lie to you. This is going to be humiliating, and it is going to be public, and your son is going to fight dirty. Are you ready for that?" I told her I did not have a choice. And she said, "There is always a choice. You could offer him a settlement. Give him a chunk of the money to make him drop it and go away." And I felt something go hard and straight up my spine, and I said no. I said I will not pay my son to stop attacking me. I will not teach him that this works. If he wants to fight, then we will fight, but we will fight with the truth. Miriam Katz looked at me for a second, and then she nodded like maybe she had been hoping I would say exactly that. But being ready for it did not make it hurt any less. The weeks that followed were about the worst of my life. The independent evaluation meant appointment after appointment. Doctors asking me what day it was, what year it was, who the president was, asking me to count backward and remember 3 words and draw the face of a clock. 66 years old, a nurse for most of them. And there I sat proving to strangers that I was not crazy, that I could be trusted to buy my own groceries and pay my own bills. It is a special kind of shame, being made to audition for the right to run your own life. I passed everything, every test. The doctors even remarked that my mind was sharp for my age, sharper than average. But sitting in those chairs answering those questions, I have never felt so small. And the whole time, out in the world, Daniel was doing the other thing, the quiet thing, because he did not just file papers. He talked. He was careful about it, the way he was careful about everything now. But word started getting around town. That poor Daniel, having to step in because his mother was slipping. And oh, had I heard. Apparently, the old woman had gotten her hooks into some rich old man and talked him out of a fortune before he died. Real predatory, taking advantage of a lonely widower. That was the story making the rounds. That I was some kind of gold-digging nurse who preyed on a dying man. My Harold, my dear friend Harold, who sat on my porch and grieved his wife with me. They took the kindest thing I ever did, sitting with a dying woman and looking after her heartbroken husband, and they turned it into something filthy. People I had known for 30 years started looking at me different at the grocery store. Some of them stopped saying hello. And then came that first hearing, the temporary one, where Marissa took the stand. She sat up there in her expensive black dress and she swore on the Bible to tell the truth. And then she looked over at me with these big, sad, concerned eyes and she lied through her teeth. She said she had watched me get confused at the reading of the will. She said I repeated myself, that I forgot names, that I seemed lost. She said Daniel was heartbroken, just heartbroken, over what was happening to his mother, and that all he wanted was to protect me. She was good. I will give the woman that. If I had not been sitting right there knowing every word out of her mouth was a lie, I might have believed her myself. Miriam got up and asked Marissa whether it was true that she and Daniel stood to benefit financially if Daniel got control of my money. Marissa smiled and said her only concern was for her mother-in-law's well-being, that the money meant nothing to her. Miriam asked if it was true they were carrying a great deal of debt. Daniel's lawyer shot up out of his chair object before she could get any further, and the judge sustained it, and Marissa stepped down with that little satisfied look smoothed right back onto her face. She had planted her poison and walked away clean. But I saw Miriam write something down on her yellow pad, and I saw the way she watched Daniel while his wife lied, and I got the feeling my lawyer had just caught a scent of something. I went home from that hearing feeling like I had been turned inside out for the whole town to look at. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, too worn down to even turn the light on, and I thought, I cannot do this. I cannot stand up in a courtroom and watch my own child lie about me and not just fall to pieces. Grace was staying with me by then, taking care of me like our whole life had flipped around and now she was the mother and I was the child. She kept asking me if I was going to be all right, and I kept telling her yes, because that is what you tell your kids, even when it isn't true, especially when it is not true. It was late, near 11 o'clock, And I was sitting there in the dark with a cup of tea gone stone cold in front of me when my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost did not answer it. I am glad now that I did. It was a woman's voice on the other end, and she sounded nervous, almost scared, talking low like she was afraid of being overheard. She said, "Is this Ruth Calloway?" Daniel's mother. And I said it was. And she took a breath and she said, "My name is Colleen Boyd. I am an operating room nurse. I worked with your son for a lot of years, and I have been reading about what he is doing to you in the paper, and I cannot keep quiet about it anymore. There is something you need to know. Something about Daniel that he has spent a lot of time and a lot of money making sure nobody ever finds out." My heart started going so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked her what she meant, and she said, "Not on the phone. Can we meet somewhere? Just you. It is important, Mrs. Calloway. It has to do with why your son needs that money so badly. And it has to do with a patient who is not around to talk about it anymore." And then the line went dead. And I sat there in my dark kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to my own heartbeat, understanding all at once that I did not know my son at all, that maybe I never had. Colleen Boyd picked a little coffee shop 2 towns over, the kind of place nobody we knew would ever wander into, and she asked me to come by myself. I did not tell Grace or Sam where I was going. I just said I needed some air. I think a part of me was afraid that if I said it out loud, if I let anybody else into it, then whatever this woman was about to tell me would become real. And I was not sure yet that I wanted it to be real. She was already there when I came in, tucked in a booth in the back with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she was not drinking. She was maybe 50, with tired eyes and dark circles under them, like she had not slept right in a good long while. When I slid into the seat across from her, she looked around the room twice before she said a word. "Thank you for coming," she said. And then she told me. She had been an operating room nurse for almost 30 years, and she had scrubbed in on hundreds of Daniel's surgeries. She said he was good. She wanted me to know that first. He was genuinely a gifted surgeon. But about 2 years ago, there had been a patient, an ordinary woman, a grandmother, in for an operation that should have been routine, the kind Daniel had done 1,000 times. And something went wrong on that table. Colleen said Daniel made a mistake. A bad one. She was careful with her words. She said she was not a doctor, and it was not her place to say exactly what. But she was standing right there, and she saw him nick something he should not have. And she saw the bleeding start, and she saw him lose control of the situation. And that woman did not make it off the table. She died right there in that room. I felt sick. I put my hand over my mouth. And Colleen reached across and touched my arm and said, "That part, Mrs. Calloway, that part could happen to any surgeon alive. Surgery goes wrong sometimes. Good people make terrible mistakes. If he had just told the truth, that would have been the end of it. But he did not tell the truth." She said that in the days after, the medical record got changed. The chart, the official account of what happened in that room, it did not say what Colleen saw with her own 2 eyes. It got rewritten so that the woman's death looked like some rare, unforeseeable complication, an act of God nobody could have stopped, instead of a surgeon's error. The family was told their mother died of something nobody could have prevented. They grieved her, and they buried her, and they never knew any different. And Colleen said the worst part, the part she could not live with, was that she had written her own notes that day, the way she always did, in her own hand, right there in the room while it was happening. And her notes did not match the chart, not even close. She had reported it. That is what she wanted me to understand. She was not some coward who sat on it all these years. She had gone to the hospital, to the people whose job it was to look into these things, and she had told them what she saw, and she had shown them her notes. And nothing happened. She got called into a meeting. She got told she must be mistaken, that she was not qualified to second-guess a surgeon, that she was putting the whole department at risk with wild accusations. And not long after that, Colleen found herself pushed out. Her shifts got cut. She was made to feel like a troublemaker until she finally left on her own. She said Daniel had money and standing and a lot of important friends, and she had a nurse's word and a spiral notebook. And back then, that was not a fair fight. So she had gone quiet, and she had hated herself for it every day since. Then she opened up the bag next to her and took out a folder, and inside were photocopies of those handwritten notes, the ones she made in the room the day that woman died. She slid them across the table to me. Mrs. Calloway, she said, I have carried this for 2 years. And then I opened the paper and read that he was standing up in front of a judge, calling his own mother crazy, trying to take everything you have. And I thought, if a man will do that to his own mother, then I am done being scared of him. She looked at me and her eyes were wet. Somebody has to tell the truth about your son. I figured it ought to be me. I do not remember driving home. I honestly do not. 1 minute I was in that booth, and the next I was sitting in my own driveway with the engine off, holding a folder full of a stranger's handwriting, trying to breathe. My boy, my Daniel, a woman was dead, and my son had lied about it and let her family bury her believing a lie, all to save his own hide. This was not a man who had gotten greedy over an inheritance. This was so much worse, and so much older than that. This was a man who had already sold his soul once, a long time ago, and had been hiding the receipt ever since. I took it all to Miriam Katz the next morning. I put Colleen's notes on her desk and I told her everything, and I watched my lawyer go very still. She read those notes twice. Then she set them down real careful, like they might go off. And she looked at me and she said, Mrs. Calloway, do you understand what this is? This is not just a sad story about your son. If a medical record was deliberately altered to cover up an error that caused a death, that is not malpractice. That is a crime. And she said something that has stuck with me ever since. She said, a paper notebook is one nurse's word. But medical records these days are all in the computer. And computers remember everything. Every time somebody opens a chart, every time somebody changes so much as a comma, the system writes it down. Who did it and exactly when. She called it an audit trail. She said if that chart was changed after the fact, then buried somewhere in that hospital's computer was a record of Daniel doing it, with his name and the date stamped right on it. And that, she said, is the kind of proof that does not care how nice a man's suit is. The next few weeks, Miriam went to work in a way that would have scared me if she had not been on my side. She filed a complaint with the state medical board. She got lawyers involved who knew how to make a hospital hand over what it did not want to hand over. And slowly, piece by piece, the whole ugly picture came clear. The audit trail was real, and it said exactly what Colleen said it would. The record of that woman's surgery had been opened and edited 3 days after she died, 3 days after she was already gone, by Daniel's own login. There it was, in numbers that could not blush or look away. My son had sat down at a computer and rewritten a dead woman's last hour to protect himself. But Miriam found something else too, and this was the piece that finally made the money make sense. Because I had never understood the money. From the very first day in that lawyer's office, watching Daniel do arithmetic in his head over $1 million, I could not figure out why a rich and successful surgeon needed my little inheritance so bad he would burn down his own mother to get it. And now I knew. He was not rich at all. It was all paint over rot, exactly the thing Walter always warned about. Miriam pieced it together from records the court pried loose. There had been a settlement, a quiet one, sealed up tight, paid to make that grandmother's death go away without anybody asking too many questions. And it cost Daniel more than he had, more than his insurance would cover, more than he could ever let Marissa or anybody else find out about. It had cleaned him out, and to stay afloat, to keep the big house and the 2 cars and the whole shining life that was the only thing standing between him and being that poor kid with cardboard in his shoes again. My son had taken out an enormous loan, $1.5 million, and he had borrowed it against the money he was expecting to inherit from Harold, because everybody knew Harold was old, and everybody knew Harold loved our family. And Daniel had bet the whole game on that old man dying and making him rich. And then Harold's will was read. And instead of a fortune he could grab, Daniel got $1 million, with the rest locked away in a scholarship fund he could not touch. $1 million against $1.5 million loan that was coming due. He was upside down. He was drowning, right there in the room, doing the math while the rest of us celebrated. And the only pile of cash left anywhere within his reach, the only thing that could pull him back from the edge before that loan came calling, was the $1.5 million Harold had left to me. Free and clear, liquid, sitting in a bank account belonging to a 66-year-old widow he was pretty sure he could have declared incompetent. That is why the guardianship. That is why the rush. That is why my own son looked at me like an enemy across a lawyer's table. It was never about protecting me. I was not his mother in that equation. I was a bank account he needed to get his hands on before the bill came due. Now I have to tell you the last piece, because it is the piece that finally let me breathe. All this time I had been carrying around Harold's envelope, the personal one he wrote to me in his own shaky hand, the one Mr. Ostrander slid across the table. And God help me, I had never opened it. I had been too raw, too scared, and then too buried in lawyers and hearings. It sat in the drawer of my nightstand for months. But that night, after Miriam laid it all out, I went home and I took it out and I finally read what my old friend had to say to me. It was not long. Harold was never one for a lot of words. He wrote that he had never had a daughter, but if he had, he would have wanted her to be like me. He wrote that what I did for Eleanor, and what I did for him after, was the only true kindness he ever got in this life that did not come with a hook in it. And then he wrote this. He wrote, I have set this up so that it is yours and yours alone, Ruthie, where no one can take it from you and no one can talk you out of it. Not a soul. You have spent your whole life letting people take because you love too much to stop them. This one time, I am making sure you get to keep something. Do not let anybody tell you that you do not deserve it. I sat on the edge of my bed and I cried, but it was a different kind of crying than I had done in a while. Because I understood now. Miriam had already found out from Mr. Ostrander that Daniel had gone to Harold before the old man died and tried to smooth talk his way into controlling the estate, positioning himself the way he positioned everything. And Harold, sharp as a razor right up to the end, had seen straight through him. He had watched the way my son was with me, the coldness, the calculating, and he did not trust him 1 inch. That is why the trust company. That is why the independent doctors and the video of the signing and every careful thing he did. Harold was not some fortune teller who saw the future. He was just an old man who paid attention. He had looked at my son with clear eyes and seen exactly what I had spent 43 years refusing to see. And he had quietly built a wall around me to keep it out. And that is the thing that finally undid me, sitting there on the edge of my bed. Not Daniel's lie. Mine. Because Walter had seen it too, hadn't he? My Walter, who was always a little harder on Daniel than on the other two, who used to say a boy, ashamed of where he came from, will spend his whole life running from it, and never once stop to see what he is trampling to get away. I used to think Walter was being unfair. I used to defend Daniel to his own father. It never once crossed my mind that Walter was not being unfair. He was just seeing the truth and loving the boy enough to try to steer him off it. A dead man and an old friend had both looked at my child and known him for what he was. And I, his own mother, had looked at that same child every day and seen only what I wanted to see. That is the blindness you choose. I told you about it at the start. I just did not know yet how much it had cost me. I sat there a long while in the dark, and then I wiped my face. And I picked up the phone, and I called Miriam Katz. And I told her I wanted to walk into that courtroom and put every last bit of it in front of the judge. All of it. Colleen's notes, the audit trail, the loan, Harold's letter, the whole rotten truth. No more settlements. No more protecting the good name of a man who had let a stranger bury her mother on a lie. If my son wanted to stand up in public and call me crazy, then he could stand there in public, while the whole world found out exactly who the crazy one was. Miriam was quiet for a second on the other end of the line, and then she said, "All right, Ruth, then that is what we will do. The final hearing is in 2 weeks." I hung up, and I looked out my bedroom window at the dark shape of Walter's porch swing down below, swaying just a little in the wind. And for the first time since that thick envelope landed in my mailbox, I was not afraid anymore. I was ready. The morning of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed fuller than I ever expected. That gold-digging nurse story had done its work, and my private heartbreak had turned into the kind of small-town spectacle people cannot help but come out to gawk at. There were folks in those benches I had never laid eyes on, and a couple of reporters with little notebooks, all of them there to watch a mother and son tear each other apart over a dead man's money. I dressed plain, the way Miriam told me to. A navy dress, my hair pinned back, no jewelry at all except the wedding ring Walter put on my finger 46 years before. She said, "We want the judge to see an ordinary, honest woman, not somebody doled up and fighting over a fortune." So that is what I gave him. Daniel came in about 10 minutes after me, flanked by his 2 lawyers in their expensive suits, with Marissa clicking along behind him in her heels. And Lord, he looked bad, thinner than I had ever seen him, gray in the face, his suit hanging loose off his shoulders like it belonged to a bigger man. He did not look at me, not once, but I could not stop looking at him. I sat there hunting through that worn-out stranger for my little boy, for the child who used to crawl into our bed during a thunderstorm, and I could not find him anywhere. That was the hardest part, not the hate, the looking and the not finding. The judge was an older man with a full head of white hair and a pair of tired eyes that told you he had spent about 30 years watching people do the very worst things to each other. When the clerk called it out, in the matter of the guardianship of Ruth Calloway, the words hit me like a sentence being read. My son had made my own name sound like a diagnosis. Daniel's lawyer went first, and he was smooth as glass. He never once said an unkind word about me. That was the trick of it. He stood up there and painted my Daniel as the good and dutiful son, the successful surgeon who had put his own good name on the line to do the hard and loving thing that nobody else in the family had the courage to do. He talked about my age. He talked about the natural, sad realities of a mind getting older. He called Daniel to the stand, and my boy sat up there and swore to tell the truth. And then he spoke about his grave concerns for his mother's well-being in this low, heavy, sorrowful voice. And I will tell you, he was good too. If I had not been sitting right there knowing the truth, I might have believed every word. I might have thought, what a fine son that woman has, stepping up like that. Then it was our turn, and Miriam Katz stood up, and she did not raise her voice one bit, and she took my son's whole world apart brick by brick. She started with the one thing his lawyers could not talk their way around. She called the court's own doctor. Not my doctor, not somebody we hired, but the independent evaluator the judge himself had appointed, a man with no reason on this earth to take my side. And that doctor got up and said plainly that he had examined Ruth Calloway thoroughly, and that my memory, my reasoning, my judgment, all of it, was fully intact. Sharp for my age, he said. Above average, even. He found no sign of any decline at all. Daniel's lawyer got up and tried to poke holes in him and got nowhere, because you cannot argue with a man who has no stake in the fight. And right there, that should have been the end of it. On its face, the whole guardianship was already dead in the water. But Miriam was not out to just win. She had told me, back in her office, that when somebody drags an innocent old woman into court like this, you do not just get her off the hook. You show the Jackley why she was ever put on it. And that is when she turned toward the money. She laid out the financial picture like she was dealing cards. There had been a sealed settlement, she said, a large one, paid out quietly a couple of years back to make a certain matter disappear. It had cost my son more than he had. And to stay afloat, she said, Dr. Calloway took out a loan, a very large loan, $1.5 million. And she paused. And she let that number sit in the air a second. And then she said, borrowed against an inheritance he was expecting from the late Harold Prescott. Daniel's lawyer came up out of his chair hollering about relevance. And Miriam looked at the judge and said, Your Honor, it goes directly to the good faith of this petition. And the judge, watching all of this over the top of his glasses, said, I will allow it. And I looked over and saw Marissa's face. And I understood in that instant that she had not known. Not about the settlement, not about the loan. She was learning it right there in that courtroom, same as everybody else. That the man she married was made of paint and rot, and her mouth had come open just a little. And all that cool, careful composure had gone straight to pieces. Because now the whole thing made a terrible kind of sense. $1.5 million loan coming due. $1 million from Harold, locked so tight he could barely touch it, and $1.5 million in cash, free and clear, sitting in his old mother's bank account. He was not drowning because he was greedy. He was greedy because he was drowning, and I was the only life raft left in the water. And then Miriam brought it home. She called Colleen Boyd. That brave, tired woman climbed up into the witness stand, and she told the whole room what she had told me in that coffee shop, about the surgery that went wrong, about the grandmother who died on the table, and about how, 3 days after that woman was already in the ground, her medical record got quietly rewritten so it looked like nobody's fault. Colleen had her notes, the ones she wrote in her own hand the day it happened. And Miriam had the other thing, the thing a suit and a good reputation cannot argue with, the computer records, the audit trail. She put it up where everybody could see it, cold and plain, a log showing that chart being opened and changed 3 days after the patient died, stamped with Daniel's own login, his name, the date, right there in numbers that could not cry and could not look away and did not care one bit how respected the man was. And that was the moment the whole thing broke open. Because here is what Miriam did to that judge's mind, without ever once saying it out loud. She let him see it for himself. The man sitting there asking the court to rule that his mother could not be trusted to think clearly, could not be trusted with the truth of her own life, was a man who had sat down at a keyboard and falsified a dead woman's final hour to save his own skin. His white coat had been his whole weapon against me, my word against a doctor's. And in about 10 minutes, Miriam Katz took that white coat and showed the whole world the stain on it. Every grave concern he had voiced about my mind was worth exactly nothing now, because it came out of the mouth of a proven liar. She was not even finished. She put up the last of it, the wall Harold built to protect me, the video of that sharp old man signing his trust, clear-eyed and certain, the evaluations his own lawyer had insisted on, and she reminded the judge that a self-made millionaire, in full possession of his faculties, with every reason to be careful, had looked at Ruth Calloway and trusted her completely and called her the one true kindness of his life. Some gold digger, some confused old fool. The story they had spread all over town died right there in that courtroom, and everybody in it knew it. At the end, Miriam asked if I wanted to say anything to the court, and I said I did. I got up into that stand on legs that were not quite steady, and I looked out and I found Daniel, and this time I did not look away. I said, my son wants my money. That is all this ever was. And he was willing to stand up in front of this whole town and call me crazy to get his hands on it. I am not confused. I am not slipping. I am 66 years old and my mind is as clear as it has ever been. I am just a mother whose child decided she was worth more to him as a bank account than as his mama. And I said, if he had needed help, any kind of help, all he had to do was come sit at my kitchen table and ask, and I would have given him everything I had, same as I did his whole life. He did not have to do this. He did not have to do this. And my voice cracked on that, and I stopped, because I was not going to give anybody the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. And I had said the only thing that mattered anyway. When I finished, Daniel's lawyer got up to have his turn with me, and I could see right off what he meant to do. He was going to make the old woman look like exactly what they had been telling everybody she was. He came toward me slow and easy, with this soft, patient smile on his face, the kind of smile you give a child who has wandered off. And he said, "Mrs. Calloway, let me just ask you something simple. Do you even know what year it is?" And he smiled wider when he said it, real pleased with himself, like he had just laid the winning card down on the table. The whole room went still, and I looked at that man, and then I looked past him, at my son sitting there at his table, and I held Daniel's eyes and I did not let go of them. I told the lawyer the year. I told him the month and the day. I told him the name of the judge and the name of this case, and the number the clerk had called out that very morning. And then I said, "I have been a nurse for most of my life, young man, and I have asked that exact question to 100 frightened old people to see if their minds were still with them. So I know precisely what you are doing, and I am still here. My mind is right where it has always been." I answered every little thing he threw at me, clear as a church bell, and the whole time I kept my eyes on Daniel, and I did not once look away. And in the end, he was the one who could not stand it. My son dropped his eyes to his own hands like a boy caught at something, and the lawyer sat back down, and he did not have another question for me. And for just a second, when Daniel lifted his head again, the mask slipped all the way off him. I do not have good words for what was underneath it. It was not the cold thing anymore, and it was not the rage from the lawyer's parking lot. It was something young and scared and ashamed, the face of the boy who used to come to me in the dark when the thunder rolled. My whole body wanted to cross that room and go to him. That is the thing nobody warns you about. Even then, even after all of it, the mother in me still wanted to hold my child. But I did not move, and he looked back down at his hands, and the second passed, and it was gone. The judge did not take long. He said he had reviewed the independent evaluation, and it was plain to him that I was fully capable of managing my own affairs, and the petition for guardianship was denied. Then he took his glasses off and he looked straight at my son, and he said that in all his years on the bench, he had rarely seen a proceeding brought in worse faith than this one. He said the evidence of altered medical records was deeply disturbing, and that he was referring the whole matter to the prosecutor's office, and that the state medical board would be looking hard at what had been laid out here today. And he told Daniel that a man who would do this, to a stranger and then to his own mother, had better be prepared for what was coming. Then he banged his gavel, and it was over. I had won. Grace grabbed me and Sam wrapped both arms around me, and the three of us just held on. But I was not looking at them. I was watching my oldest boy gather up his papers with shaking hands while his wife would not even look at him, and I did not feel like somebody who had won a thing. I felt like a woman watching the last wall of something she had spent her whole life building come down around her. Because I had gotten my money and my good name and the judge on my side, and I had lost my son, and I already knew, walking out of that courthouse into the daylight, that winning and losing had gotten all tangled up together, and that the hardest part was not behind me at all. The thing nobody tells you about justice is how slow it moves, and how little it actually feels like winning while it grinds along. The verdict in that courtroom was not the end of anything. It was just the first domino. Over the months that followed, the rest of them fell, one at a time, and I had a front row seat to all of it, whether I wanted one or not. The state medical board opened its own investigation, and once they got hold of that audit trail, there was not much for them to argue about. My son sat down at a computer and rewrote a dead woman's chart, and there was a record of him doing it, plain as day. They took his license. Just like that, the thing he had bled for. The thing Walter and I ate beans for a decade to buy him. The thing that was his whole identity gone. Doctor. Calloway was not a doctor anymore. He was just Daniel. Then the prosecutor got involved, the way the judge said he would. Falsifying records to cover up a death is not a slap on the wrist. And there was the sealed settlement on top of it, and the fraud that came with all of it. Daniel's fancy lawyers stopped talking so tough once they saw what the state had. In the end, he took a plea, because there was nothing left to fight with, and he went to prison. I am not going to sit here and give you the number of years like it is a box score. I will just tell you that my boy is behind a wall now, and he has been for a while, and he will be for a while yet. But the piece of it that I think about most is the family. That grandmother who died on his table, the one nobody was ever supposed to find out about. She had children of her own, and grandchildren. They had spent 2 years believing their mother went out of this world from something nobody on God's earth could have stopped. And now, because a tired nurse finally stopped being scared, they knew the truth. I do not know if that was a mercy or a cruelty to lay on them. Probably some of both. Colleen went and sat with them after. She told me it was the hardest thing she ever did and the first time in 2 years she slept the whole night through. That woman carried a stranger's death around for 2 years and never got a single thing out of doing the right thing, except the right to look at herself in the mirror again. I think about her a lot. I think the whole world runs on people like Colleen and never once thinks to thank them. The money went the way you would expect. Once it all came apart, it came apart fast. The enormous house behind the gate got sold to pay what he owed, and it did not come close to covering it. The 2 cars, gone. The lake place, gone. And here is the thing I cannot stop turning over, the thing that would be almost funny if it were not so sad. My son spent his whole life running as hard as he could from being that poor kid with cardboard stuffed in his shoes. That shame drove every single thing he ever did. And when the running was finally over, when all the paint got scraped off and you could see what was underneath, he had less than nothing. He ended up broke, flat broke and disgraced and alone. He ran 43 years and landed right back in the exact spot he started, only worse. Because this time he had thrown away every last person who loved him to get there. Walter had tried to warn me about a man like that, in his quiet way, years before any of this. I told him he was too hard on the boy. I know now it was not hardness at all. It was a father seeing his son clear and loving him enough to try to turn him off the path. I just wish to God I had seen it too. Marissa filed for divorce before Daniel was even sentenced. I do not blame her, and that surprised me. How little I blamed her. She married a certain kind of life, and when that life turned out to be a lie held together with borrowed money, she left. She had gone white as a ghost in that courtroom learning what he had done, and I do not think it was heartbreak. I think it was a woman realizing she had hitched herself to a sinking thing and needed to get clear of it before it took her down too. She got clear. I have not heard from her since, and I do not expect to. Now I want to tell you the part that let me breathe again, because I do not want to leave you standing in the wreckage. Harold's scholarship got built, just like he wanted it. The Prescott Callaway Trade Scholarship is a real thing now, and it puts real kids through trade school every single year. Kids who want to be electricians and welders and linemen. Kids who want to work with their hands the way my Walter did. Kids who never in 100 years could have paid for it on their own. Grace left her old job and runs the whole thing, and she is so good at it it makes me want to cry, because she has that gift of looking at a kid the world has already written off and seeing exactly what they could be. Sam sits on the board and keeps the money honest. And every year I get to watch Harold's name and Walter's name go out into the world attached to some kid's second chance. 2 men who never had children of their own between them. And now there are dozens of young people out there who owe their whole future to them. I think that would have tickled Harold to no end. The first year, one of the kids who got a scholarship was a boy about 17, hard around the edges. Chip on his shoulder, you could see clean across the room. His shoes were falling apart. He would not look anybody in the eye. And when he came up to shake my hand at the little ceremony, mumbling his thank you at the floor, I swear to you my heart just about stopped, because I was looking at Daniel, not his face, his hunger, that same fierce starving thing that wants out so bad it hurts, all tangled up with that same shame at being caught wanting anything at all. And I held that boy's hand a second longer than I needed to. And I thought, it is not the hunger that ruins you, son. The hunger is fine. Half the good in this whole world got built by hungry people. It is what you are willing to burn down to feed it. That is the whole thing right there. I did not say any of that out loud. He would not have heard it at 17. Nobody does. But I hope he figures it out sooner than my Daniel did. I pray he does. I kept the house. That was never even a question. Sam begged me for a while there to come live with him where it was safe, and I told him no, the same way I would tell you no. That little house is the last thing left of Walter in this world, every board of it, and I was not about to let anybody chase me out of it, not a criminal and not my own grief. So I stayed. I put new locks on the doors, and I sat up scared plenty of nights that first year, but I stayed. And every evening, weather permitting, I go out and I sit on that porch swing my husband made with his own 2 hands, sanded smooth so nobody would ever catch a splinter. And I watch the light go out of the sky the way we did together for more than 40 years. Some evenings I talk to him a little. I figure he can hear me just fine. And I visit my son. I want to be honest with you about that, because I am not going to hand you some tidy little ending that ties up in a bow, because life does not do that, and I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. Daniel and I are not healed. I do not know that we ever will be, not all the way. Too much got broken, and some things you break do not go back to how they were, no matter how sorry everybody is. But I drive out to that prison, and I sit across a table from my boy, and we hold hands. And mostly we do not say much of anything. There is not a whole lot left to say. The first few times he could not even look at me. Then one visit, way down low, so quiet I almost missed it. He said he was sorry, Mom. That was all. Just sorry, Mom. And he cried, and I put my hand on the side of his head the way I did when he was little and the thunder scared him. And I let him. I did not tell him it was okay, because it was not okay, and he knew it, and a lie would not have helped either one of us. I just let my boy cry, and I held on to him, because whatever else he is, whatever else he did, he is still mine. He came out of my own body, and there is no undoing that, not with a verdict, and not with a prison, and not with anything else in this world. And you do not stop loving your own child just because he got lost. You love him from further off, is all. And you leave the porch light burning, just in case he ever finds his way back to it. That is the whole story. That is what a dead man's money did to my family, and what it showed me about my own child, and about my own 2 eyes that would not see. I have made my peace with most of it. The rest I am still working on, one swept porch at a time. People ask me sometimes if I ever forgave him. Forgiveness is not a door you walk through one time and then it is behind you. It is more like a porch you have to sweep every single morning, knowing the dust is coming right back. Daniel lost his license, his marriage, his freedom for a good long while, and not one bit of that was mine to choose or to stop. I still go and see him. We do not say much. What I finally learned, too late to save him but not too late to matter, is that the money never changed my boy at all. It only turned the volume up on who he already was, and made me hear the thing I spent his whole life refusing to hear. Walter climbed poles in the freezing rain for 40 years so strangers could keep their lights on, and he died owning less than our son owed his lawyers. But he died whole. That is the only inheritance that ever really counted. So love people exactly as they are. Just do not hand them the keys to your life. You keep those. They were always yours.